Hi everyone. This lecture goes with week 2 of Social Work 620, Ethics and Social Work Practice, and the title of this lecture is Values, Ethics, Image, and Behavior in Social Work Practice. What we're going to spend our time talking about today is values and ethics in social work practice. This week we're sort of making a pivot to talk about ethics, but then we're going to talk about how values and ethics inform the behavior of clinicians and the image of our profession more generally. So I know there's a lot of reading for this week, so what I wanted to do is sort of highlight some of the big ideas from some of these kind of disparate readings. One of the big ideas here in this first bullet point I've listed is that our professional and personal values interact to determine how we move forward in a practice situation. And this is actually kind of a controversial idea. There are some people who are arguing that we should eliminate or at least reduce the emphasis on personal values and identify really a common set of professional values. This would probably have some benefits. It'd probably reduce ethical violations. It'd probably increase the quality of practice and help to unite the profession a little bit. In this class, we sort of take the perspective of, it's a bit of a hedge, quite frankly. We're going to do some personal values exploration. That's what you're going to do in one of the written assignments for me. But we also spend a lot of time discussing professional values as well. So as this controversy sort of works itself out in the profession, you'll be in a good place to move in either direction based on how the controversy sort of works itself out. So professional and personal values interact. They determine how we sort of move forward. But there are folks who are thinking we should be relying on a common set of professional values only. More on that in a second. The second big idea here is that an over-reliance on personal values may be a factor in some of the ethical violations. And this is actually one of the reasons why people think we should identify a common set of professional values. The third reason people think we should identify a common set of professional values is that this over-reliance on personal values has contributed to the sort of fracturing of our profession. And that's kind of what McLaughlin is talking about in that piece, and Squiat and Stowe are talking about in their respective pieces. It's this idea that social work has become a lot of things to a lot of people, and that we've lost our identity as sort of social workers. We've gotten involved with too many different kinds of things. Say what you want about whether or not that's a good thing, but what it's done is sort of create a fracturing of the identity in our profession. So let me advance the slide here and just move my picture a little bit here. So a couple more big ideas, though, and this is actually some good news if the previous slide was some bad news. Two of the values that really do unify our profession are human rights and social justice. And these are things that we've got to spend a little bit of time talking about. So human rights is this idea that there's a common set of socially constructed but inalienable rights that cannot be denied to people. So they might include things like healthcare, education, access to clean water, so on and so forth. In fact, human rights are derived from the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which you can Google if you want, and you can see what they are. And social justice is that there should be sort of a long-term movement towards social justice, right? Sort of towards an improvement in the quality of life and well-being for all people. And the good news is that the values of human rights and social justice sort of unify all these different sort of segments of the social work profession. And so that's probably a good thing. This also gives us a chance to sort of clarify what a value is and what an ethic is. an ethos. So human rights and social justice are really long-range and idealistic values. They tell us what is good or what kind of society we should be working towards. So we'll start to sort of operationalize values as these things that we know as what is good, and we'll start to think about values as things that tell us what is right. So values tell us sort of what end goal we should be working towards, and ethics actually tells us what's right given a seemingly contradictory situation or some kind of an ethical conundrum. So if you skip that fourth bullet point for a second and just drop down to that last one, ethics guide our decision makings, that sort of in the moment decision making. Values guide our goals for practice, and I don't mean the goals that we articulate with clients. I mean the reasons why we became social workers and the reasons why we do social work in the first place. What impact are we trying to have on society? That's what the image of that impact is, what our values help us define. It's our ethics that help us guide our decision making. So back up a second now to this fourth bullet point, which says, bear in mind our process involves identifying personal and professional values and acting in accordance with professional values. And this is sort of a reflection of what I said a second ago in the previous slide, that our process in this class sort of is a hedge against this conflict between personal values and professional values. We explore our personal values, we also explore professional values, so you're well prepared to move in either direction as the field sort of works this conflict out. Okay, moving on. Let me just advance the slide here. So we're going to talk about values and behavior here a little bit. Advance the slide again. So quick review. Social work practice typically is divided into micro, mezzo, and macro systems. So the micro system comprises individuals and families. The mezzo system is typically comprised of institutions and groups, and then the macro system is large-scale systems, societies, communities, systems of law, systems of culture, so on and so forth. And the point of the sort of ecosystemic model here, or the ecological model, is that these different levels of practice interact, and they all have an influence on one another. So the macro and the mezzo system have an influence on the individual, and the macro and the mezzo system have an influence on the micro system, just as the micro system can have an influence on the mezzo and the macro system. And then there's all kinds of different combinations there that you can spend a few minutes thinking about. But the reason we're doing this actually is to start to talk about how values function to determine human behavior at the micro level. So the book uses this example of Jean Valjean. He steals a loaf of bread to feed a hungry family, and this really is sort of a moral conundrum, right? Stealing obviously is wrong, but permitting his family to go hungry is also sort of wrong. And so do you violate one set of laws in service of something good, right? Do you violate laws that prohibit theft in service of feeding a family? Or do you continue to let a family go hungry in service of respecting social laws that prohibit stealing? So there are sort of a bunch of let me just move myself here so we can see this bottom set of bullet points. So there are theories that can help explain moral choices, and really moral choices are what become our behavior. So biological theories, psychological theories, social theories, and spiritual theories all help explain these moral choices. Right? Hunger is a sort of a biological problem that Jean Valjean has to sort of deal with here. On the other hand, maybe a spiritual theory might be an acknowledgement that that stealing is wrong, or let me say that a different way. Spiritual theory might help us recognize that stealing is wrong. But then on the other hand, a spiritual theory might help us acknowledge that taking care of one's family is a important and reasonable thing to do. So spiritual theory might actually get us to this place where there's a conflict between letting letting your family continue to go hungry and stealing a loaf of bread. So this is important because this helps us unpack the behavior of clients and others, and this helps us understand ourselves as well, and starting to understand how our morality guides our own behavior helps us make deliberate and reasoned and purposeful ethical choices. So I'm going to put myself up here on this slide just so we can see all of the images on this different kind of thing. So here's a psychological theory of basically moral reasoning that was identified or articulated, I should say, by Kohlberg, and he basically came up with these sort of 6 different psychological stages that people go through with respect to morality. We all start at the bottom, and ideally we would all end at the top towards principle and social contract. But and then he further, let me say this real quick. He further subdivided each of these 6 sections into 3 additional levels, what he called levels: pre-conventional reasoning, conventional reasoning, and post-conventional reasoning. And again, the idea is that a person, as a person ages and matures and sort of develops through her life course, you go further and further up to the top of that pyramid. So that that first or that bottom stage in the pyramid really is about avoiding punishment. He calls it an obedience and a punishment orientation. So you only do things in order to not get in trouble. And if we were thinking about Jean Valjean and the issue of bread versus feeding a family, punishment is probably attached more to stealing a loaf of bread. So if someone were acting in a way that was merely to avoid punishment, they would be unlikely to steal a loaf of bread, because stealing a loaf of bread would come with some degree of punishment. The next level is self-interest, and that's where people are willing to accommodate punishments because self-interest, frankly, comes with a lot of rewards. So this is sort of the second level. And these 2 levels together form what he calls pre-conventional reasoning. Level two, which is conventional reasoning, is sort of this is comprised of the interpersonal accord and conformity, and then authority and social order maintaining orientation. And these start to get a little bit more complex, and the complexity sort of intensifies as we get up to stages 5 and stages 6. So in the interpersonal accord and conformity thing, we act in ways that are similar to what others would do. We conform with others, so we adopt the attitude of a good boy or a good girl or a good person, because that's what people around us are doing it. In that 4th level, we defer to law and order. So we do things based on this knowledge that there is a greater good, and that there's some kind of agreement about what forms laws, or why we have laws and why laws have authority. We've all come to some agreement that laws are important, and they helped protect and maintain society, and that's why we acknowledge them. In levels 5 and 6, in this post-conventional reasoning piece, we can think about the social contract and the individual rights orientation, and then lastly this universal ethical principle. So in level 5, with this social contract and individual rights orientation, what we're thinking about here is this this idea that there's a social contract that should be provided for everyone, and people can act in ways, if that social contract isn't fulfilled, in an effort to get their needs met. And thinking about that with respect to Jean Valjean means that we actually need some more information. How long, if we were to determine what he was going to do, whether or not he was going to steal a loaf of bread to feed his family, how long is the family been hungry? How is the bread fresh, or is it, has it been discarded, thrown away for the day? Is the baker, the person who made the bread, struggling himself or herself, or is he well off and doing exceedingly well? In other words, how would stealing the bread impact the baker? These are the kinds of things that we start to think about. And then in universal ethical principles, sorry, there was a little glitch there, so I'm just going to say the universal ethical principles thing. In that stage, morality is really based on this idea that ethical decision-making transcends mutual benefit. The other way to sort of think about this is, the further and further you go up the pyramid, the more and more room there is, the more and more shades of gray there are, and the more room there is for incorporation of other information. Nevertheless, what this sort of tells us is that moral reasoning is actually a very difficult thing to do, and two people can come up with very different directions for action given the same set of information, and the differences are primarily explained by where a person is on Kohlberg's hierarchy, and how they reason, sort of the relevant factors. A couple of slides ago, at the beginning of the lecture, what I was talking about was sort of the conflict between professional values and personal values, and this explains why there is such a conflict between sort of heterogeneous personal values and homogeneous professional values. Kohlberg gives us insight into why we can get to a place where we have heterogeneous personal values, and then why that can be such a problem. So what we'll do with this slide here, let me describe each of these 3 bullet points to you real quick, and then what you can do is pause the video and give some thought to where each of the people in these 3 short little statements, what stage they would be in Kohlberg's trajectory, and then you can restart the video and you can hear my answers. So, at which level of moral development is a social worker who says, "I should not impose my beliefs on a client who refuses to leave what I believe is an abusive relationship because all clients have a right to self-determination"? One more time. At what stage is at what stage of moral development is a social worker who says, "I should not impose my beliefs on a client who refuses to leave an abusive relationship because all clients have a right to self-determination. So I refuse, I should not impose my beliefs on a client who refuses to leave what I believe is an abusive relationship because all clients have a right to self-determination. Okay, number 2. At which stage of moral development is a coworker who says, I just can make up information in my client records because nobody will ever know? And then lastly, which stage of moral development is a teenager who says, I know I shouldn't tease people because they're different, but I have to do it. I have to tease people or I'll be one of those people who gets teased. So let me put the previous slide back up real quick, and you can give some thought to where each of those 3 situations would be. Pause the video if you like, and then we'll come back here in a second. I'll give you my answers. So, my answers, let me just put myself back down here in the corner. So at which level of moral development is a social worker who says, I should not impose my beliefs on a client who refuses to leave what I believe is an abusive relationship because all clients have a right to self-determination? I would argue that a social worker who says that is in the principle or the universal ethical principles stage of moral reasoning, according to Kohlberg. A coworker who says, I can just make up this information in my client records because nobody will ever know. I would argue that that person is in the self-interest stage of things, so pretty close to the bottom there. And where is a teenage client who says, I know I shouldn't tease people because they're different, but I have to tease them or I'll be the one who gets teased? Well, given that information, you could argue that that person is in either the first or second stage of Kohlberg's development. They're definitely avoiding punishment, which would be teasing. They're also acting in a self-interest. And then if we had additional information that said, sort of everyone's doing it, they might even be in sort of that interpersonal accord or conformity situation. So they're probably in the self-interest orientation, given the very limited information in that vignette. But I think there's an argument for any one of those 3 stages, according to Kohlberg. All right, so moving forward here. Here's sort of another example. Suppose a social worker doesn't want to report child abuse because she thinks she can work out problems with a client. And let's say maybe you're a colleague of this social worker and you think that she's operating at a conventional level of reasoning, so that those middle 2 stages of moral development. How might you explain the importance of reporting child abuse? So let me go back real quick to this. Right. So we believe, or we conclude, that the social worker in this case is somewhere around here in terms of their moral development. So they're probably acting, they're probably interested in conformity, and they're also interested in authority and social order. What kinds of things might you say to her in order to encourage her to report child abuse? Well, if we were to take, again, if you want to pause the video and think about it for a second, that would be fine. But if we were to take sort of a law and order approach, one of the things to say might be, well, it's okay that you think you can work this out, but there's state law that demands we report child abuse, and so we have to act in accordance with the law, and that demands that we report it. That would be one possible option there. There are, of course, lots of other factors that affect moral decision making. Kohlberg was really only one person who sort of articulated a framework for thinking about moral reasoning across the lifespan. But that's a pretty broad model, and it's a pretty general model. There's certainly other things that influence our moral decision making. They have to do with our attitudes, our emotions, or our feelings, our beliefs, our values. And mental health problems kind of affect all of these things. So mental health problems tend to blunt our ability to reason well, and they tend to make us recognize skewed information. So that's actually one of the reasons why it's really important for us to take care of ourselves when we're in practice, and even when we're in graduate school. So let me give you one more example, since there's a typo in that one there. A coworker, we'll call her Shirley, asks you for help. She tells you that she messed up, and she messed up badly. She just finished a session with a husband and wife and thinks that the wife may be in danger because of something that she said in the session. Your coworker doesn't want her supervisor to know. She is afraid she'll be fired. How are her feelings affecting the decisions that can be made? And I won't give you my answers on this one. I'll let you give some thought to that. But think about how her feelings are leading her to this place where she doesn't want her supervisor to know that she messed up. That's why those things are in bold. I'll let you reflect on that for a second and then keep watching the video. Okay, so moving on to talking about social factors and decision making. Some of the social factors that might influence our decision making here are things like social learning, our social identity, the social context, and then things like peer pressure and group norms. So let me spend just a minute talking about each of these things. So in social learning, which we'll spend time talking about in other classes, but in social learning, we learn by watching others about what's good or what's bad or what's not good. And so we don't have to have direct experiences ourselves in order to come to the conclusion that something's good or bad. We can view or observe corporal punishment. Doesn't even have to be necessarily right in front of us. It could be in a movie or in a book or hearing about it some way. And if we heard that corporal punishment worked, we might come to the conclusion that corporal punishment is a good thing. On the other hand, if we hear all of the bad things that corporal punishment might have resulted in, we might come to the conclusion that corporal punishment is bad. And this would be the case even if we ourselves have never experienced corporal punishment. So social learning, viewing the experiences of others, having observed the experiences of others, are a big influence in our moral decision making. Our social identity is a big factor in our moral decision making as well. So our social identity comes in typically our own identities. So for example, what does it mean to be a good social worker? Well, or what does it mean to be a good Latin American mother or a good Muslim son? These social identities tell us how we should act if we're going to maintain that identity or we're going to keep that identity intact. And sometimes they can influence our moral decision making in good ways or in bad ways. Social context can influence our moral decision making as well. And this example here is kind of silly. I'll get to it here in a second. But the social context influences our moral decision making as well. So what we might do in some situations is different than what we might do in other situations, based on what that social context is. So the question here is how many of you would agree that people should wear clothes when they're in the presence of strangers. And this is an online class, so I'm just going to fill in the blanks here a little bit and say that I think most of us would agree that people should wear clothes when they're in the presence of strangers. So say you're grocery shopping or something like that, or, shopping at the mall, or, shopping for clothes or something like that. Most of us would agree that it would be important to wear clothes at that time. But what if the context changed? What if the context was you're at the doctor's office and the doctor is doing a physical, right? That's actually a social context in which it would be appropriate to not have clothes on, or to only have certain clothes on. So that social context, what's expected of us in a given social situation, has a big influence on our moral decision making. And then lastly, things like peer pressure and group norms have an effect on our moral decision making. So the Stanford prison experiment was noteworthy because it asked people to role play as guards and as prisoners. As prisoners and as guards in an experiment. And they actually had to stop the study because the people who were assigned to act as guards took their role a little bit too seriously, and that was it was a social context thing as well. But when they took their roles too seriously, they started mistreating the people who were acting as prisoners. And so this is actually one of the studies where we learned an awful lot about group norms and things like that. Lastly, spirituality is something that influences our own moral decision making quite a bit. Now, spirituality is different from religion. Religion typically is organized around doctrine and tradition, and sort of formal worship. Spirituality is merely a belief in mysticism or higher order kinds of things. So I've got some questions on here that typically tell us how we think about spirituality. How do we, what inspires us to do good? What kinds of things give our lives meaning and direction? There is kind of a trick question down here at the bottom that asks, how can you bring spirituality into ethical decision making? And if you've been sort of picking up on some of the hints that I've been leaving in this lecture, one of the things that, in this lecture and the previous week's lecture, one of the things that I've sort of suggested it's really important to do is learn to separate your own values and your own ethics from what are professional values and professional ethics. And so the answer really to this question, like I said, this is kind of a trick question. It's not really appropriate to bring your own spirituality into it, but it would be very appropriate to consider a client's spirituality or a client's religiosity, depending on what the client's belief system is. So let's talk about values and research a little bit here. There are this is really just an introduction to research ethics, but since our profession is rooted in research and sort of empirical questions, it's important to be able to think about how we arrive at the knowledge base through sort of ethical practice. So the common rule really just tells us that there are three standards to which all research must adhere. They are beneficence, justice, and respect for personhood. We learned, or we came to the conclusion that these common rule ideas were important from mistakes that happened during Tuskegee and Nuremberg and in Milgram, the Milgram experiments. These are all things that you'll cover in a research methods course. So one of the things that I'll highlight now with respect to research ethics really is just that there is a degree of informed consent to which we all must adhere, and that's that participants are informed about the risks and benefits of research. They have the mental capacity to consent, and that they understand that research is completely voluntary. So if you see a little thing up in the top right-hand corner, my computer disk is filling up, that's what that is. So I have to dismiss that message every now and then. Sometimes in research, risks and benefits aren't known, and this creates kind of an ethical challenge that we need to work through. We also have to ask ourselves if it's ethical to entice someone to participate in research by offering them money. Most research typically involves some kind of an incentive, but that incentive really has to be matched to that person's investment in the research process. Then we have to ask ourselves about doing research with vulnerable populations, which social workers are often doing. We're often interested in working with vulnerable groups. And we're often interested in vulnerable groups because we're trying to do some advocacy work. But all of these carry with them sort of special ethical considerations. The point of these slides really is just to highlight that there's really no part of the social work profession, whether it's practice, research, advocacy, that isn't somehow underpinned or based on the foundation of ethics. Real quick, let's cover the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. So confidentiality means that the researcher knows to whom the data belong, but there is a promise, often a legal promise, not to publish any of that identifying information. Anonymity, on the other hand, is a complete inability to match participants with the data that they provided. That information often isn't collected at all. So both provide a measure of protection for clients. Anonymity probably provides a little bit more protection for clients, but anonymity isn't always feasible, especially when we're doing long-term studies and we need to be able to match participants' data over time. But again, the point of this is to highlight that there is no part of social work profession or no part of the social work profession that isn't somehow underpinned by ethics, and that includes research. So confidentiality and anonymity obviously have a lot of implications for how we manage data. They also sort of influence how we report findings or publish findings. We often don't report on individual cases, individual participants. What we often do is report global or cumulative numbers. That's aggregate data. So we don't report on one participant. We report on maybe the average of 50 or 100 or 200 participants. That's what's meant by global and cumulative there. One of the groups that monitors research and social work practice would be the Institutional Review Board. You'll go through an Institutional Review Board process when you put together your capstone. But your task, essentially, when you do that, will be to talk about how you're going to protect the ethical, or how you're going to conduct research in an ethical manner and protect the rights of participants. Again, this is really only introductory kinds of stuff. This is stuff you'll cover more in depth in other kinds of classes. We also have to justify ethics in our research questions, so we have to make We have to make sure our research questions are ethical. That can be a tough thing to do. Ethical research questions benefit people. So the answers to those questions have a practical utility, a practical benefit. And then we also have to make sure our research designs and processes are ethical. So can we justify withholding treatment in random assignment studies? Can we manage the risks? These are all things that, like I said, that you'll talk about in your research methods classes during the MSW program. Last thing to cover here in this talk, we know, we've covered some of the things that influence moral decision making and things like that. The thing that we also need to be able to do is to start to critique them, or come to a place where we can kind of critique them. And the reason we do this is that this helps us determine which one is the best, and which one is sort of most suited for use in a given situation. So this is one of the ways we do this. We ask 3 questions. We can deconstruct theories, and we can also apply this to simply concepts or ideas in social work as well. So we can ask 3 different questions that give us insight into what the best possible theory or concept might be in a particular situation. So we can ask, what does this theory say about the nature of people? We can ask, what does this theory say about how people change? And we can ask, what is the theory's preferred choice of how people should be? So in some ways, these are sort of esoteric. These are sort of abstract questions. But let me just talk about each of these for just a second. So the first question we can ask is, what does this theory say about the nature of people? Well, the answer to that might be, or some of the possible answers to that might be, are people fundamentally good, or are people fundamentally bad? Do people act only in their self-interest, or are they capable of acknowledging the risks or the interests of others? Basically, what does this say about human nature? So like I said, these are pretty philosophical questions here. So secondly, second question we can ask when we're critiquing theories is, what does this theory say about how people change? Is change a process, or is it an outcome? Is it something that happens all at once, or is it something that happens in fits and starts and with setbacks, that kind of thing? And then lastly, what is the theory's preferred choice of how people should be? So in an idealized world, what should people look like, or what kind of qualities should they exhibit? I'm going to give you a chance to practice this and sort of explore these questions a little bit more in the discussion for this week. But in order to do that, what we'll use to sort of practice those critique questions are the 4 values of the social work profession. And the 4 values are beneficence, empowerment, strengths, and autonomy. So beneficence is simply that benefits outweigh harms. Empowerment is that people have the authority to do something, oftentimes for themselves. Strengths is that people can leverage what they are good at to grow or change. And autonomy simply says that people are capable of acting for themselves. So remember, these are values, these are not ethics. And when we talked early in the lecture today about what the difference between values and ethics are, and these are things that are good candidates for that broad class of sort of homogeneous professional ethics that I alluded to earlier in the lecture. So, discussion for this week. What we're going to do is practice deconstructing a theory. So pick a concept from class. It could be one of the ideas from the previous slide: beneficence, empowerment, strengths, or autonomy. And consider the 3 questions about it. What does that concept say about the nature of people? What does it say about how people change? And what does it say about how people should be? these are not questions that have right or wrong answers. These are questions that are designed to stimulate thinking. So what I'm looking for in your discussion post for this week is evidence of thought, and evidence of sort of considering the process of things. Respond to your colleagues, offer some criticisms, offer some positive feedback, and some other things to think about. Again, no right or wrong answer here. What I'm really looking for is your sort of engagement in the process, and engagement with not only the concept but the question as well. Also, I did rewrite the instructions for the discussion in the discussion board section itself, so you don't have to refer back to this presentation for that. And just to give you an idea about where we're going, in the next couple of weeks we're going to shift from talking about values to talking about ethics. Now, we don't leave values behind completely. You're still going to do an autobiographical assignment for me, and that's really a chance for you to do some exploration of your personal values. But what we're going to do here, starting in these next couple of weeks, is start to talk about professional ethics. And remember that we're really making a distinction between values and ethics in this class. Our ethics guide decision-making in practice, and our values give us an idea for what an idealized world should be, or what our goal should be. What a perfect world would look like, or something like that. Now, I'll conclude with just reading this bottom bullet point here. Our ethics and values are similar, and they may appear similar, but again, we're making that distinction. They also often align, but remember that they're different, and there's going to be times when they don't often align. And in that case, we have to remember that when they don't align, what we privilege is that professional set of ethics, and that professional set of values. As always, thanks for watching. Any questions, let me know.